Good evening.
It's great to be here with you. Thank you for having me here. I live on the western shore over in Pasadena, so it's nice to not have to come too far. And I apologize for being late. I got a little bit stuck in traffic. I thought tonight I'd just tell you a bit about myself, my family story in the state, talk about some core policy concerns of the campaign, and then take any questions that you have. You heard, my name is Ben Jealous. I met Bob outside, Bob Hardy. I said, well, you're Hardy and I'm jealous. When your last name's one of the 7 deadly sins, you might as well just have fun. My parents met as school teachers in Baltimore, Baltimore's Harlem Park Junior High, in 1966. Dad proposed 3 times in a week, and then Mom said yes, and they had to leave the state because their marriage was against the law here. Mom's black, Dad's white, and it was also illegal for them to remain in the state. The case Loving versus Virginia was moving through the courts. It reminded you that the sheriff could come right into your bedroom if you were cohabitating as man and wife across racial lines. And as my dad said, well, we didn't need Jealous versus Maryland. We already had Loving versus Virginia, and that was a better name for the city. I was sent back to Maryland every summer to know where I was from, to know where our family was, to know my family and be part of it. My grandparents had moved here in World War II. Granddad to work the B&O Railroad. Grandma went to work for Planned Parenthood in Baltimore in 1941. My grandparents are my heroes. Grandma would go on to be a social worker. She trained Barbara Mikulski. Barbara was a young social worker. I saw Barbara at the Emerge Maryland event a few weeks ago. My running mate, Susie Turnbull, is one of the co-founders of Emerge, and Bam came up to me, wagging her finger, and said, "You're Mamie Todd's grandson." I said, "That's right." She started to tear up. She said, "Well, you see how just saying her name, my grandmother is now 101. Wow. She said, you see how just saying her name affects me?" I said, "Yeah." She said, she helped me make sure I didn't feel awkward when I was a young social worker. And all I can think is, wow, Grandma did a really good job, because I've never seen Senator Mikulski look awkward in my entire life. My grandfather would go on to be a probation officer and work about 30 years in the city courts in Baltimore. He was really known for having an open door at home to some of the toughest men in the city. He would say to all the young men that he supervised, if you ever have a tough day and you don't know what to do, you just come to my house when I get off work, and we'll sit down and we'll figure it out together. His motto was, "Courage today saves lives tomorrow." And my grandparents taught me really, and my parents, that the most important way to live your life is the most important way to lead, which is with courage. And that courage really comes from love. And love is to be extended to all of your neighbors. And in our faith tradition, the church I was baptized in and I attend, St. James Episcopal Church in Baltimore, 4th generation of my family to attend. Very clear that the neighbor really includes the stranger in your midst seeking refuge. Not just people who look like you or live near you. And it's those values that guided me at the NAACP, and it's those values that are guiding us in this campaign. My grandma also taught me to always listen before I leave. And I've traveled to every county of the state, and most of them multiple times, listening to people. And what jumps out at me really are, frankly, what the young people have to say. I went back to the McCullough Homes housing projects in West Baltimore, where my mom spent the first half of her childhood. Sat down with a young man who was about the age that she was when she left, about 7.5 years old. Boy. And I said to him, what needs to change? And he just looked at me and said, "I've seen too many dead men." Mm-hmm. And literally that same week, I was in Talbot County in a backyard, bucolic setting, looked like the set of the Gilmore Girls. And 100 people, and a young woman a girl came out. She's 13 years old, 9th grade. Ponytail, coming back from tennis practice. All she wanted to talk about was the 3 classmates she had buried in the past year because they had overdosed on opioids. Our young people across the state are hurting in ways that's hard for us to comprehend. You just look at student debt. Average debt coming out of our public university, about $30,000. When my grandfather went to the University of Maryland School of Law for a year, tuition was $200, now it's $31,000. But it kept up with inflation to be $2,500. The difference is $100,000 in debt. And so I want to talk tonight about a couple of policies, proposals we've put out there, and then again, take any questions that you have. So if you look at the issue of, for instance, healthcare, including rehab, we really have to make sure that people of our state have what they need no matter what happens in Washington. This opioid epidemic has been allowed to spiral out of control over the last few years. The governor really only when he was getting ready for re-election did he come out and talk about the need to deal with it. And it's killing young people, old people, every income strata, every race across our state. I'm the only candidate to put out a full-fledged plan on how to deal with it. We need to start by making sure that we get all of the rapid response teams that our state legislature has called for. They called for 12 across the state. The governor gave us 1. We need to follow that up by making sure that places like Baltimore no longer have to ration anti-overdose medication like naloxone. We're literally allowing Marylanders to die for want of $2 million a year in a state with a budget that's over $40 billion. It's ridiculous. But what it really taps into is the fact that we treat healthcare in this state as if it's a privilege when it should be a right. We have 350,000 Marylanders without healthcare right now. If Trump has his way, and eventually gets rid of S-chip, that'll be 140,000 more children who don't have it. I almost died as a child because my family didn't have healthcare and I developed a juvenile seizure disorder. I can tell you how important state healthcare programs for children are because I wouldn't be here if it didn't exist when I was a child. But more importantly, our healthcare system right now is literally the worst deal you can possibly get. The overhead is more than twice as high as systems in Canada and England and France. Drug prices, we typically pay 2 to 5 times as much as they do. And we can change that. In order to change that, we have to be willing to go to a universal health care, a Medicare for all system for our state, no matter what happens in Washington. As soon as we do that, we can cut overhead at least by half, because for Medicare it's 3%, but for Blue Shield it's 17%. And Canada it's 8 or 9%. And any of us, I've been a CEO of a nonprofit or a partner in a business since I was 26 years old. Any of us who manage a budget know that cutting your overhead by 17% to 8 or 9 or maybe 3 is a much better way to operate. But also our federal government has prohibited our federal government from getting us a better deal from the pharmaceutical companies. But states and localities still can. So if we move to a healthcare for all system here where basic health insurance is provided by the state can get a better deal for pharmaceuticals, which also allows us to stretch our dollars further. Other candidates will come in here talking about a public option. All I can say to you is go read the health study done in Oregon, a state about 2/3 our size, by the RAND Corporation. RAND Corporation is a centrist think tank first started by the Air Force. You said the public option won't cost much because it won't do much. It'll just help you kind of create the politics to maintain the status quo, and that's the most expensive option. If you look at education, similarly, the politicians in our state, unfortunately in both parties, have become too comfortable with the status quo. And literally, if you just look at what's happened in the last 24 hours, as you've seen schools across the state with entire wings, sometimes the entire school, so cold that children are in their jackets trying to study, literally taking standardized exams this week in the middle schools. Both my kids are in public schools, my daughter's in the 6th grade. Taking your standardized exams while you're shivering. It's a reminder that we've been massively underinvesting in our schools for a long time. And folks will say, oh, we just can't afford to properly fund them, and it's just not true. Our state budget is over $40 billion. The state is underfunding the schools by less than $2 billion. The localities are also about $1 billion. As governor, you're responsible for the state. State budget's over $40 billion, we're underfunding by less than $2 billion. What that means is that it would take less than 5% of our budget to properly fund our schools. Talk to state budget experts, they say the money's there. You say, well, why hasn't it happened? They say, well, that would require making some tough decisions, and most folks in Annapolis just don't want to do that. When you're trained as an executive in politics, when your first job as an executive, say as a county exec, your incentives are misaligned from day one. If you go have a tough conversation about the budget, about priorities, and you make tough decisions, you're told you probably will lose your job. But when you're trained in the real world, whether it's nonprofits or for-profits, I've been involved in both in my career, it's just the opposite. If you don't have a tough conversation about budget priorities with love, and they make tough decisions, you could lose everything. And our kids are suffering across the state because we don't have the courage to just be the grown-ups in the room, have a tough conversation about our budget, build our budget from the bottom up. So when I'm governor, we will practice participatory budgeting. We will make sure that the people of the state are involved in setting the budget priorities, and we'll build the budget up from there. And education always comes in first in our state. We'll make sure that we fully fund education. My mom had to sue Western High School for Girls when she was 12 in West Baltimore, so she could desegregate it when she was 15. And when you grow up in a family that was involved in the Brown versus Board of Education era litigation, what you know is what Thurgood Marshall did. That until we fully fund the schools, we don't solve the problem. It's always been the case that sort of racial discrimination is sat inside of a larger bucket of class-based discrimination in our society. You travel around the state, Eastern Shore, Western Maryland, South Baltimore, West Baltimore, East Baltimore. Hey, you see a lot of poor black kids who are not getting educated well. You see a lot of poor white kids who aren't getting educated well. You see a lot of poor, every type of kids not being educated well. It can no longer be the case in Maryland that your zip code determines how good your education is. Which brings me to the last thing, which is our, just the priorities around how we invest in our young adults. One of the things that is frustrating about Maryland when you have two kids in the public schools like I do is, as a business person, you quickly figure out we have to import everything in our state. Every job tract, every industry imports most of its talent from elsewhere. And yet you see young people who are being pushed into dead ends in their own lives by an education system that claims to be preparing all of them for college, when we know most of them won't go. And that really earnestly needs to get back to preparing every child for a career. There's no reason why we should have shortages of welders, truckers, art teachers, construction managers. The largest public university program that we have in Maryland for producing construction managers produces 20 a year. The state needs 3,000. Whiting-Turner needs 300. We produce 20 in our largest public university program. And we can fix that by better aligning our public universities with industry, by pushing the trades back into our high schools, and quite frankly, by fully funding our schools, because you really have to make sure for whether that kid's headed into a trade or headed to school, to college, you show up to kindergarten ready to learn. You gotta have full day universal pre-K. You gotta raise teaching back to being a first-class profession. You gotta pay your teachers well. When you look at our public universities and the debt crisis that I alluded to earlier, it really comes down to this. The conversation with the president of Penn State 5 years ago, I said, what's your biggest challenge? He said, it's like Groundhog Day every year. Every year I go to the state capitol, try to keep so much more money from going to the state pen. So just a little more can come to Penn State. It's the same states across the country, it's the same here in Maryland. As we've spent more and more on higher incarceration, putting addicts into prison when they should have gone to rehab, we've invested less and less in public higher education. As we've invested less in public higher education, guess what? Tuition's gone up. Student debt's gone up. Student default rates have gone up. And now young people have just started to increasingly decide, I just can't afford to even try. When I'm governor, we will first make sure that our community colleges are free. There's a will to do it now in the state legislature. We'll just go get it done. Second, we'll follow behind New York in raising the income levels for the equivalent of Pell Grant support higher, deeper into the middle class. College becomes more affordable. And third, and it'll take some time, we will reverse that 40-year trend of investing more and more in incarceration and less in public higher education. As we switch to smart on crime strategies in which we make sure that addicts go to rehab, not prison, that we focus our law enforcement resources on getting more of the violent people off the street, and we make our prisons smaller the way that not just New York and California have, but Georgia and Texas have. No reason, like when did Maryland have to follow behind Georgia in doing the right thing? But that's where we are right now. If there's anything that I really learned from my grandparents and their careers in public service in Maryland, it's that you can't half solve a problem. That if you just bring half a solution, whether it's the public option or it's our so-called Justice Reinvestment Act here, where we boldly propose to shrink our prison by 5% in 10 years. States like Georgia are on track to cut theirs more like 30–40%. You still have a problem. If you half solve a problem, you still have a problem. That problem can't get worse. It can't get bigger. And so you got to provide whole solutions to whole problems. And that's what we're seeking to do in this campaign. No one deserves your support, frankly, unless they can win. And beating Hogan is going to come down to voter turnout. And I've built a team to do just that. My running mate, Susie Turnbull, was chair of the Democratic Party in 2010 when our turnout was 125,000 voters higher than it was in 2014. And the voters who turned out in 2010 had turned out in 2014, Larry Hogan would have lost by 62,000 votes rather than winning by 63,000 votes. My campaign manager is Travis Tazzolari, was the executive director of the party then, and led the coordinated campaign to re-elect Martin O'Malley that defied national trends that year, 2010, when the Tea Party swept into power everywhere else, by turning out massive amounts of Democratic voters. How did he do it? He put 10 times more organizers on the ground than the party would in 2014. Every corner of the state. When I was president of the NAACP, Van Jones on CNN called me and the NAACP under my leadership, the unsung hero of Obama's re-election, because we turned out 1.4 million unlikely voters in a year. Frankly, when folks were worried that black folks, especially black men, would not turn out to vote, we set records. We did that after running the largest door-to-door voter registration effort in the country that year. When you tell me that the way that you get rid of an incumbent Republican governor is voter turnout, I get excited. Because that's what I've done my entire life since I was a 14 and 15-year-old Democratic precinct captain in the Jesse Jackson's campaign and in Dukakis's campaign. Susie, who supported Hillary in the primary, when I supported Bernie in the primary, both of us, of course, supported Secretary Clinton in the general. Susie Turnbull and I are building a robust, unifying campaign that's going to take to beat Larry Hogan. And I hope to have your support. Thank you. Do we have time for a few questions?
Yes.
Yes, ma'am.
I travel a lot to Baltimore for my job.
Yep.
I work for a regional bank.
Okay.
What are your thoughts on, the violence and the destitute population there?
Yep.
The lack of jobs and the youth. I drive down the streets and, people that should be in school are hanging out on corners.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on Baltimore? All we hear is how the murder rate is higher than it's ever been.
Yeah. No, that's right. No, thank you. And first of all, thank you for recognizing the connection between the two things. Hopeful people don't kill each other. And, whether it's deaths from bullets, and I've had 2 family members shot in the last 10 years, or it's death from overdoses. I have another family, those were both in Maryland. I have a family member in a different state who's in rehab for heroin addiction right now. Both of them are really being driven by a certain hopelessness amongst our young people that's in too many corners of the state. But in Baltimore, we've got some special issues to deal with, because Baltimore is frankly is defying the trends of other cities like DC and New York, where violence has come way down. First thing we have to do is to do the things that work. What we've learned in New York City, when I was president of the NAACP, I was helped to push through their Community Safety Act, organized a big citywide coalition to get that done. At the center of that was expanding their violence interrupter program. In Baltimore, we call that Safe Streets. Now, Baltimore has approximately 55 out of the 200 neighborhoods in Baltimore are high poverty neighborhoods, and a lot of them are high crime neighborhoods. Safe Streets historically has been in 4 neighborhoods. We need to understand that the Safe Streets program is more effective at stopping the next shooting than the police are in most instances. I'll get to that in a second. On average, shooting goes down by 26% in any neighborhood that they're active in. Shootings have been going up across the city. If we expanded Safe Streets into every neighborhood where killings are common in Baltimore, we would see it reverse, is basically what this pilot program has showed us. We need to do that earnestly. That's what they've done across New York City. It's had a huge impact. The best thing that the police can do to stop the next killing is to get killers off the street. And that means that you have to deal with the shortages on the Baltimore Police Department very quickly. Starting with making sure that the homicide unit is no longer understaffed and that it's well-staffed with the best trained officers. It means that we have to be prepared to raise the pay of officers, because Baltimore City is a training ground for Baltimore County and multiple other counties who recruit the best officers from it. And you can't afford to lose your best detectives all day long when you're dealing with a homicide crisis. Same thing for the Special Victims Unit that deals with rape, as well as those who are dealing with home invasions, and the clerks who are supporting them. In Baltimore City right now, you have a more than 1 month of backlog for entering in the warrants for people for second-degree assault and below. How many second-degree assaults turn into homicides over that month? So we have to kind of a both-and strategy. What we cannot do is what Larry Hogan is proposing. He is proposing a return to failed war on drugs strategies like truth in sentencing. I teach criminal justice policy at Princeton University. I'm a criminologist because my granddad was in law enforcement in Baltimore City for 30 years. My granddad would tell you if he was here, law enforcement's like anything else. If you focus on one thing, you're not focused on something else. And so what's kind of behind that approach, that failed war on drugs approach, is what's called the broken windows theory. Broken windows theory says if you focus on the real small things, you can prevent the real big things. Turns out if you focus on the real small things, you don't solve the real big crimes. The cities that practice it, what you saw over 20, 30 years, was their homicide case solve rate, what they call the close rate, trending downward. Because if you're focused on busting people for low-level drug possession, you're not investigating the last rape or the last homicide. So we've got to return kind of the priorities of officers back to what they used to be, which is solve the most serious crimes first. At the same time, we have to recognize that things like truth in sentencing, what the governor is pushing, are very expensive, and all the social science shows you did not make us any safer. So there's no reason to go back and do that again. But dealing with the symptom only gets kind of half the problem. You have to go further. We have to recognize that in neighborhoods like Upton, in Sandtown, where the uprising started, where my family's journey in Baltimore started, half the men have been jobless for a very long time. We have to be focused on bringing jobs back to Baltimore. I've said that when I'm governor, making Maryland 100% reliant on clean and renewable energy will be our moonshot. That's why I've been endorsed by Friends of the Earth and by Bill McKibben. Part of that is about saving the environment. Part of that is about bringing factory jobs back to places where we've lost them. Because in order to make our state 100% reliant on clean and renewable energy, 2/3 of that will come from offshore wind. And if we're deploying that many turbines, we can be building them here. And if we're building turbines here, we can be employing men in multiple places and women in multiple places who, quite frankly, their only path to getting good paying jobs is if they can do something with their hands. At the same time, in a city like Baltimore where we have a hub for Amazon distribution, we should really be building out our light manufacturing, because that's a hub to distribute throughout the country. And where we have a massive port, as we do in Baltimore, we should also be building out a larger free trade presence so we can export to the rest of the world. That's the type of thinking and type of action that we need in the city. Fundamentally, you've got to start with good education. I've talked about that as well. But good schools, good jobs, and law enforcement that actually does what works is the only way to turn things around in Baltimore. Yes, sir.
Yeah, what you said about your grandfather, having people come over to his home,
Yeah.
I think that's important. I don't know Baltimore very well, but I know Anne Arundel County very well, because I worked there as social worker for close to 30 years. And you look at areas like Newtown 20,
Yep.
where there's a lot of men that are sitting, young men that are sitting on the street not doing anything.
Yep.
And the big problem they have is not the schools, because they have voted out of that area.
Yeah.
They don't see themselves succeeding in schools. The big problem they have is they can't conceive of themselves being successful.
Yeah.
You can have new jobs coming in, and they won't apply for it, because those are for other people who are competent, not them.
Yeah.
And what it seems to me is that we need people like your grandfather, that will go out in the community, social organizers,
Yeah.
and work with those men to show them that they are a resource to the state, not a liability. And if we don't do that for them, if they can't conceive themselves
Yep.
as being successful, they will not be.
No, that's exactly right. And you talked about living and working in Anne Arundel County for 30 years. And my grandfather, he lived in McCullough Homes Housing Project. He lived on Pulaski Street. He lived all across the west side, and he served the Western District for 30 years. And what you find when you're dealing with discouraged men like that, disconnected young men, is that if you can get social workers from that community back, right? So they don't see becoming a social worker as a way to move somewhere else, but they come right back to where they're from. That's the most effective way. And law enforcement from those communities as well, and teachers. And quite frankly, we have a shortage of male teachers. We have a shortage of male social workers. And there's sometimes when you're intervening with a young man that you really need to have a young man do the intervention. Just like sometimes you're intervening with a young woman, you need to have a young woman do the intervention. When I'm governor, we will have a real focus on getting more male teachers into schools, especially in high poverty areas where the young men need role models. And we'll have a real focus on getting public servants in general to from the very communities that they'll serve. Absolutely. Yes, sir, I think you had a question too.
Well, it's kind of piggyback, basically what I was gonna ask is, education is obviously very key.
Yeah.
How do you get these kids from just sitting on the corner and getting their rear ends in school?
So thank you. It's a great question, and starts. And I made a short reference to it by getting trades back into the high school. And you need art back in the high schools. You need music back in the high schools. There are 4 or 5 major learning styles. The kind of high-stakes testing approach that we take in our high schools now only applies well to one of them, which is the auditory. It's what allows those of you who've been listening well for half an hour to do that. But it's like 1/5 of us who can really do that well. And that lines up well with going to college and sitting in a classroom with 300 people. For the rest of the students, we got to push trades back into the high schools. Part of making our community colleges free will allow us then to have more dual credit classes in our high schools and push community college education into the high schools, which give young people a reason to stick around if they can't see themselves going to college, but they can see themselves becoming a plumber or a nurse or an electrician. So that's part of it. 2, you've got to take that all the way down into the elementary schools. Young people by the 4th or 5th grade have an idea of what they want to be when they grow up. And they've got to make it clear to them that if you stay in this through high school, if you're headed towards college, we'll help accelerate you there. But if you're headed towards being a plumber, which, you know, there's a lot of plumbers making a lot more money than a lot of college graduates. And a lot of PhDs even, who are working at Starbucks. That's a whole other thing. You know, that will help accelerate you through that too. And so we have to change the culture. Again, it has to be about we're here to prepare you for a great career, not simply we're here to prepare you for college. Because the young people reverse engineer that, and they say, oh, well, if I'm not headed to college, why am I sticking around? Yes, sir. Then
2017, Larry Hogan signed an executive order for those seeking state contracts. They could not hold the position of BDS, which is boycotting the sanctions
Sure.
of the state of Israel for the illegal and authoritarian treatment of the Palestinian people. Would you rescind that executive order, or if that order came to you via law, would you veto it?
So I do not support BDS. I don't think it's an effective way to actually improve things in the Middle East. And I'd be clear about that. At the same time, I'm very concerned the way that an increasing number of U.S. Senators are and the ACLU is, that having a prohibition on boycotts, because this legislation moving through Congress would go further, actually violates the First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. And as a guy who on the one hand, you know, descends from abolitionists, on the other hand descends from 7 Revolutionary War soldiers in the Massachusetts Regiment, we're very proud of the Boston Tea Party, amongst other things they were involved in. I'm very concerned about the First Amendment implications of that executive order. And I would take counsel from the ACLU and we would take it from there.
So you would not.
I haven't dug all the way into it, but what I'll tell you is that, you know, as a civil rights leader, as a First Amendment guy, that when the ACLU raises their hand and says there's a real issue, and mind you, the ACLU raises their hand on things, whether it's the NAACP or the KKK, like they're kind of neutral arbitrators. I take that concern seriously. Yeah.
How do
Bob?
you combat Governor Hogan's, I'm a businessman, I know everything, if he waves his hands? Okay, just like somebody else we know.
Yes.
So, you know, they get the 4-word sentence out there
Yep.
and excitement.
Yeah. You know, as Democrats, we have to be on the side of small business people, folks who are seeking to grow their small businesses into big businesses. We have to be willing to talk about it. We have to be willing to think about it. I invest in small businesses. That's what I do. My business partner is a guy named Mitch Kapor. Mitch founded Lotus 123, Lotus Notes. It was Excel before Excel. And we're invested in about 150 startups across the country, 4 right here in Maryland. One of them started by a Baltimore City school teacher, grew so fastly last year, had to move offices 4 times. And what I know is when you sit with small business people across the state, I've been having pretty good luck getting them to support my campaign, sometimes over Hogan, sometimes they voted for Trump, you know, but over other Democrat candidates, because basic things like rising healthcare costs are choking their small business. Over in Talbot County, I have a guy who's a finance manager, car dealership, who voted for Obama twice and they voted for Trump, because he really believed Trump would give us like a Western European style healthcare system. And he figured out pretty quickly the error of his ways. And he's organizing other small business people who voted for Trump to support my campaign for that reason. We have to be willing as Democrats to stand up and say, you know what, we need a different culture in many of our offices across the state that are responsible for approving permits. We choke businesses that way. We need to fix it. We need to be willing to stand up and say, you know, there are redundant and unnecessary regulations and we should cut them. Just as quickly as we're, you know, comfortable saying that we're here to protect the environment. One of the things that I've said is that we take risks to grow businesses through corporations all the time in this state. Every time that we recruit a corporation here to bring jobs to Maryland, we're taking a risk, because if another state 4 or 5 years later offers them bigger tax break, they may go there. And so if we're going to take a risk to attract corporations to our state, we should be willing to take risks on behalf of our small businesses. One thing we can do, I launched my campaign at my cousin's flower shop in West Baltimore that was launched after the uprisings. Her biggest fear at Baltimore Blossoms is that she will grow her company to death before she has 2 years of tax returns and can go get a line of credit. One thing our state could do is take part of the money that we currently use to recruit corporations, back our banks in our state to give lines of credit earlier using the latest financial services technologies that allow you to use big data and other sources to assess risk better than you ever could, with a FICO score that really mostly reflects that person's parents' wealth, because that's what your credit score lines up with, and 2 years of tax returns. And so we need to be willing to do things like that, to actually embrace innovation and take some risks to grow our small businesses, because when your small businesses grow, it's actually the strongest kind of economy. It's much stronger, much more resistant, much more resilient than if you're just bringing in corporations who then move somewhere else when they get a big tax break. Yes, ma'am, in the back.
I want to know why you made the decision to run for governor, and why should I vote for you? I'm a woman in this state, and I'm pretty fed up with what some of our male leaders have done and not done.
Say more. Yes. I'm not a woman of the state. I'm a man of the state. I'm pretty fed up with what a lot of our male leaders have done and not done. But what in particular is on your mind?
Well, first what I want to know is, what was your process in making the decision to run for governor?
Sure.
What was that burning passion that you have to run for governor of this state?
You know, I don't deal with feeling helpless or hopeless for long. Donald Trump won, and kind of woke up saying the Serenity Prayer like every day. And key concept of the Serenity Prayer is to know what you can control, what you can't change. And it occurred to me that we could control our state, and we don't even do that. We, the working, struggling, striving families of the state, could control our state. And then it hit me that the most important lesson I learned in college was in judo class. The first lesson of judo is, you shall use your opponent's momentum against them. The momentum of the far-right wing has been the states' rights movement. They've concentrated power in our states for more than half a century. Ergo, Donald Trump is president. Far-right wing controls every branch of our federal government. The only way that we can really move our families forward, despite what's happening in Washington, is to take control of our state. That's why I'm running for governor. Yes, ma'am.
When you're governor, will you be able to keep the tolls down on the Bay Bridge?
And not go into debt.
Yes. You know, I mean, that's an issue that
One of
I'm.
the most popular things Larry Hogan
Okay, it's
did.
done. Yeah, no, that's right. No, that's right. You know, look, it's something that I'm looking at. I've had a number of budget experts say to me that we're going to be hit with the impact of that in a few years. I need to really understand what that means and what those numbers are. With that said, we've got to create a more fluid connection between the Eastern Shore and the rest of Maryland. We've got to have on the table, you know, putting in a second bridge lower down. You know, and we've got, and I'd say possibly even more important than keeping the tolls down is making sure that we have high-speed internet throughout the entire Eastern Shore. Because, you know, that's.
As governor, I know you woo big businesses by giving them tax breaks.
Yeah.
Can the tax breaks be hooked up with educational opportunities for those trade schools that you were talking about?
Yes.
Though the big companies guarantee they will work with these community colleges and so forth to make these kids have jobs.
So you can woo companies multiple ways. The easiest, maybe most expensive and short-sighted way is just the race to the bottom of, how much can we give you to come
Right.
here? I believe there's more intelligent ways to recruit companies to be here. Some of those for small companies, and I spent 6 months of my life last year seeking to move a small growing factory from Edmonton, Canada to South Baltimore onto a block, 3/4 of which is a public housing project, and 1/4 is a brownfield. And this particular factory, which grows a boutique type of lettuce, grows them in steel storage containers. So we could just plop them right down the brownfield. Day one, we would have had 36 low-skilled, good-paying jobs with healthcare that we could hire directly from the housing project. Day 1,000, we projected about 300. It would have changed life for that block and for much of that neighborhood. The deal fell apart because the healthcare costs in Maryland, in the exchange, but it's true overall, keep surging. And so while the Canadian entrepreneur was willing to accept the fact that he would have to pay for healthcare here on top of his taxes, as in Canada it's included, he was willing to accept it because his biggest market is the US and he would save on transportation costs by being here. What he couldn't handle was that it keeps jumping. Like it just jumped 30% again. So it fell apart. So one way, small factories, for instance, to attract them here is to have the most competitive healthcare market in the country. That's what we're going to seek to build. With bigger companies, you have to understand what their real challenges are. I'll be leading this spring a delegation of CEOs of tech companies to Maryland because they're dealing with two big pressures that they believe that they can better solve here. One is they're projecting 1 million programmer shortage in 5 or 6 years in the Silicon Valley. And we have the 5th largest tech economy here, and great schools, and so they believe, and as expensive as housing is getting here, it's way cheaper than California, and that's been the big barrier to recruiting folks there. So they believe that there's fertile ground here. The second is, and this is something Larry Hogan really doesn't get. Larry Hogan sees diversity as like an afterthought at best and a hindrance, at worst. You can see that in how he launched our medical cannabis industry, which in the state is 30% black and has, we're very well-educated black population here. There's not one majority people of color-owned company that's been given a license in a new $200 million a year industry. And so now he's quickly trying to make that up during an election year. Okay, too little, too late. In the Silicon Valley, what they're also under pressure about is that their inclusion numbers, both for gender and for race, have gone way in the wrong direction. 30 years ago, Hewlett-Packard was like 10, 12% black, 30% female. Google was like 15% female, less than 3% black. 20% of our highest trained STEM workforce here, computer programmers, engineers, scientists, are black in Maryland. They can't solve that in California. Prince George's County alone has 17 times more black computer scientists, engineers, programmers than Santa Clara County, where Google and Facebook are headquartered. And so one way is low taxes, but the other way is a highly trained workforce. And I believe that ultimately we have to look to the mid and the long term and decide we're really going to invest in educating our children to be that workforce of the future, so that our public universities, our public high schools are the fattest pipeline into any industry. Here's the funny thing, when you really get talking to industry, it turns out they don't always need what they're currently recruiting. So like Google will tell you, a buddy there who supervises 1,500 programmers. He says, look, I typically hire people with master's degrees. It costs me a lot, and there's not many of them. But honestly, all I really need is somebody with 2 years of the right community college education. And so then if you're having a conversation, say, you'll move your company here, build an expansion campus, it'll take 2 years. Well, let's start now, changing how we teach programming so we can churn people out. And there's reasons to believe that we can be hopeful. There's a pilot program happening in a rural part of California where they're educating the children of farm workers to be computer programmers. They were trying to do it in 4 years and failing because they were losing the kids every summer. So now they do it in 3 years, and rather than 70% of the kids dropping out, 85% finish. They just go 12 months a year and they push them straight through. We can be doing that in the poorest parts of the state, white, black, brown.
So just as a follow-on and kind of segue, What would your plans be, in working with, immigrants, undocumented, with the Dreamers, with DACA? What, you bring up that it's an interesting moment where governors do have quite a bit of authority
Yeah.
in the United States. So what are your thoughts and plans?
Well, I'm proud to have chaired the successful campaign to pass the DREAM Act in Maryland. And for that reason, I'm the only candidate in the country who's gone to jail outside of Trump's White House protesting his mistreatment of Dreamers. Because 2 weeks before I got the call, would you go to jail? One of our Maryland Dreamers, who had been deported suddenly, was trying to get back to his family in Maryland, the only place he can really remember growing up, was found dead in a trailer in Texas that turned into an oven, along with 20 other immigrants who were cooked because the driver tucked tail and ran and left them locked in there in the sun in Texas. And then the Young Dreamers called me and said, look, we used to go to jail in instances like this, but they'll deport us. We had just had 2 Maryland Dreamers deported because one of them won a college scholarship. My commitment's well documented, and frankly my effectiveness on it. As governor, I would make sure that we pass the Trust Act. And Fox News and other things will do a lot of outlets will do a lot of things trying to scare your neighbors. It's literally the most small C conservative thing you can do when it comes to law enforcement. Los Angeles Police Chief Daryl Gates of Rodney King infamy, like a broken clock, was right at least once. Digital clock. He was the first major city police chief asked by then what we called INS, now ICE, to deputize his officers as immigration officers. And he said, no, thank you. And they said, why not? And he said, because we have one job, which is to keep the public safe. And if we allow you to give us 2 jobs, we'll do our one job less well, we'll be distracted, that will make us less safe. And then the immigrants, not just the ones who don't have papers, but all of them, will stop talking to us, and we'll lack the intelligence we need to solve crimes, and that will make us less safe. And then criminal networks will start victimizing them, especially knowing that they don't talk to us, and that will make us less safe. So no, we're not going to do it. And you can count on me to do that, and to generally act with compassion. We have young people on the Eastern Shore, I've sat with their parents, who wake up every night around 2 o'clock in the morning and dash into their parents' room to see if they're still here. Half my family came here as slaves, the other half came here through Salem, and the last one's through Ellis Island. We all descend from immigrants. And most of us, if you know your family history, there was somebody who was stowed away on a ship, or knows that the reason why their Italian ancestors were called WAPs because it stood for without papers. This is nothing new. This is nothing new, and it's shameful for us as a nation of immigrants to pretend like somehow because they come from the South and not from from the East, from Europe, from Mexico, not from Europe, that somehow they're different. They're not. They're just like our ancestors were. Yeah. Sure, thank you. Very kind.
Very concerned about the fact that we've left public transportation completely off the table, it seems like in this state.
Yep.
It's negligible public transportation here in Eastern Shore.
Sure.
I commuted for a while to DC, I had to drive to Carrollton and take the bus. There's no real way to get to a state capital.
Yep.
There's no connection between DC Metro and Baltimore.
Yep.
The idea of building another bridge is great, but if you ran a train across the bridge and down to Ocean City, that would alleviate a lot of traffic.
Sure.
So I'm very concerned about the fact
Yep.
that it just doesn't even do something anybody talks about.
Yep. You look at places like the Eastern Shore, there's less population density, and yet it's rapidly becoming like the furthest suburbs for even like Washington, D.C. A lot of the solution will come with taking an on-demand approach to public transportation. Using the technologies developed by companies like Uber to allow people on a route that's not a straight line to aggregate demand for bus rapid transit and public van services. We ultimately need to invest in trains, but trains take 10 years. Sometimes you get into battles, they take 20 years. In Baltimore, we were betting everything on the red line, and Larry Hogan just redlined the red line. And in the meantime, we have folks who used to walk 2 blocks to a bus route who are now walking 6, and they get preyed upon. Meanwhile, I'm down in Worcester County or Dorchester talking to young folks who are trying to get to their job. And the bus routes are even worse than what I contended with when I was 20 years old and in Suitland, and they only ran one way in the morning and one way in the evening, and I worked off cycle. And so, in the short term, bus rapid transit, where we actually create dedicated lanes for buses and for vans, and so you don't have to contend with the traffic, is a solution we can put in place sometimes in 6 months. And actually using technology that we see as being part of the private sector, but actually bringing it into public transportation, so that we're serving people at a rate that they can't afford, that we're serving populations that may need free transportation, and quite frankly, so we can build networks that don't have to be on a straight line, is part of the solution that we're not talking about. Generally, I support trains, but we're gonna have to start, short-term fixes are gonna be vans and buses. You can't wait 10 years for putting in a new train. You've gotta have a solution now. Yes, ma'am?
Backing on that, I've worked with students in Kent County
Yep.
that would win scholarships earn scholarships to Chesapeake College.
Yeah,
They never went, because they couldn't get there.
yeah.
And it happens year after year after year. And
No,
that's just one more example.
That's exactly right. And so it's like, if you look, if somebody is a highly paid professional, that maybe taking an Uber every day is an option. But if somebody's working at Five Guys like my nephew, that's not an option. That's like your paycheck. And yet, where I live in Pasadena, Maryland, kind of down a long road full of trees, you would have to walk 2 miles just to get to the bus route. And that's not an option. I mean, I like the guy to work out, but come on, And so, that's where, why we've begun looking at what cities that don't have buses have done. And what cities that don't have buses, like San Antonio, have begun to do, is to literally apply on-demand technology to public transportation. So whereas you might have typically had a bus running in a straight line, you could have 4 or 5 vans that are just going from point to point based on what people need to get them where they need to go.
With today's technology with the phones.
Yeah. Yeah, super easy. But you're able to create these as public jobs, unionized jobs.